Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I am Laura Brandenburg, the founder and CEO of Bridging the Gap, and where we provide online training, digital toolkits, and a certification program to help you start, succeed, and excel in your business analyst career. And I am really excited today to be here with both Carl Wiegas and Candace Hookinson. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank
Happy to be
you.
here.
Excited to have you. So if you are joining us, let us know in the chat where you're joining from. And just to share a little bit about our guest. So Carl Wiegers is the principal consultant with Process Impact. He has a PhD in organic chemistry, and he is the author of 14 books, including Software Requirements Essentials, which he co-authored with Candace. And so Candace is here. She's a business architect at Archon Digital, which is a software development, professional services, and training company based in Austin, Texas. And Candace herself has over 10 years of experience in product ownership and business analysis, and is really currently passionate about understanding how to optimize Agile in large enterprises, which is a big part of what we are talking about today. So welcome to you both. So Carl, it always takes a few minutes for us to kind of reach critical mass here. And so as people are jumping on, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions that have piqued my curiosity for a while. So you separately told me that you've been, retired for 15 years, right? And yet here you are, having written another book, and we have you on this LinkedIn Live. And me personally, I have no official retirement goals, but I definitely have time and financial freedom goals. So I'm just curious about your mindset around this. And can you share, what does retirement really mean for you?
No, that's a very good question. I had to think carefully about that. A few years ago, I kind of stepped back from LinkedIn, and I didn't intend to make any more posts about books or articles or webinars or songs I recorded or talks or anything. And I was very serious about that. I mean, I have been retired for quite a while. But then there was this pandemic, see? And so I found myself stuck at home for months with really nothing much to do. So I wrote some books. I wrote a book called The Thoughtless Design of Everyday Things. And then there was still a pandemic. So I wrote a book called Software Development Pearls. And so that was kind of a way to just keep myself amused. And then you have to start doing all this stuff that looks like non-retirement to promote the book, kind of like these things and webinars and articles and interviews and podcasts and all that. So I actually officially retired 15 years, but being self-employed, like, you are and many other people, I had to think carefully about what that meant. And I came up with a workable definition, which might actually be pertinent for you as you look ahead a bit. And here's my definition. It says, I can do whatever I want to do, even if it's what I used to do, but I don't have to.
Okay. I like that. So just always a choice, right? Every single piece is a choice.
Right. Yeah, so it gives you the flexibility to do things that are interesting that come along. And I do like to write, and I like to give presentations, and I like to coach people and stuff like you do. So it gives me a chance to do those things when they come along, but I feel no guilt whatsoever about turning down opportunities as well.
Yeah, I love it. So just that choice and that volition, really. And I think part of what you have chosen to do and you've chosen to create is, 14 books. I've written 2. And so that's a bit, I know how big that is as a contribution. And I know what kind of a contribution it is as well to all the people listening here and the world of software development and business analysis. So you're creating quite a legacy. When you think about your motivation to continue writing and creating, what is it that really drives you?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned a legacy, because I saw maybe sort of a counter legacy informational message a little bit ago. I saw a guy who posted a tweet that said, I recommended a Carl Wiegers book to somebody and I got called a boomer. And he made it sound like that was a bad thing.
Right.
So maybe that's a different kind of legacy, but okay, so I admit I'm guilty. I'm a boomer. I started programming in college almost 53 years ago, which is really hard to believe. But I write an article or a book or I develop a product whenever I get an idea and motivation. And it's really something that I think that might be worth sharing that other people would find interesting or helpful. Now, sometimes my own business interests do play a part in deciding what to do. And this example might be relevant for you also, Laura. Some years ago, I decided that my strategic business objective was to earn a nice living while I was asleep. So that made me start thinking about, well, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Possible ways to generate passive income. And it takes a lot of work, as you point out, to create a product like, well, any kind of a product or a book or something. But then once you've got things in place, they sort of run by themselves for the most part, and you can generate some income without a lot of ongoing effort. But my primary motivation for writing and teaching has always been to help people do a better job on their projects than they might have otherwise, and to experience less pain than they might otherwise. Who likes pain?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
so
I find like for me, the passive income is definitely it helps keep everything going, right? But if you're not also driven by some sort of passion, it just sort of peters out, or it doesn't actually work as well.
right, right.
Yeah. And
And
I would
that's
love to know, I'm going to let you finish that, but if you have
no, go ahead.
read one of Carl's books, if you are a quote unquote boomer or not, right? I would love to know that in the comments. And especially if you're reading this most recent one, Software Requirements Essentials. It was just out for like the last month or so now, right? Is that right, Carl and Candace?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
4 to 6 weeks, something like that.
Yeah. Awesome. So go ahead, continue on.
Well, I was just going to say that, as I mentioned, and we're all in this business of consulting and training and writing and stuff because we like to help people do a better job than they would without our assistance. That's kind of the whole point. And one thing I've been fairly good at is identifying lessons, from observations that I've seen other people go through their experiences or through our own experiences. So like my last book was Software Development Pearls, which has 60 lessons I've learned throughout my career on requirements and design and project management and so forth. And like most people, we learn those lessons the hard way, right? We do things wrong, or we forget to do things, or things don't go as we planned. And so at least it's suboptimal. But it's less painful to learn from other people's painful experience by looking over their shoulders. And that's why I write a lot of the stuff I do, is to say, look, here's some stuff we've learned. You can do it better the next time. There's no reason for us all to climb the same painful learning curves.
That is for sure. That is for sure. Now, Candace, this was your first book, right? I guess I'm making that assumption, but can you just tell us a little bit, but like what motivated you to dedicate yourself to a big project like this?
Oh, absolutely. No worries. So amusingly, I was actually out of the country when I was invited to the project by Carl via Joy Baby. I was sitting in a nice British pub with my pint, but it didn't take me too long to agree to join. I actually love writing and presenting as well. And back in maybe 2015 timeframe, I was doing a lot of that. But then I got heads down on a customer project. And that was several years where I just was out of the writing and presenting game almost entirely, but I learned a ton and got a lot of lessons of my own, as Carl mentioned. And so that opportunity to go back to writing and presenting and speaking was really great. And then, of course, to get to work with someone like Carl, like what other opportunity would I have to co-author a book with such a well-known name and have someone who can mentor me in the process? I definitely had no idea what all was involved when I agreed, but I'm very glad I did it anyway.
Yeah,
me too.
Awesome. And you've been working with more co-authors lately, Carl, right? Is there a particular reason around that as well? Like, how did that fit into your long-term? Yeah.
Well, I've worked with two co-authors, Joy Beatty, who worked with me about 10 years ago on the Software Requirements 3rd edition book, and then now with Candace on Software Requirements Essentials. And it's an interesting experience working with a co-author. Both of them contributed content, for example, that I simply wouldn't have been able to write. They had experiences and knowledge on stuff that I just didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, Candace has a great deal of valuable hands-on Agile experience, for more than 10 years, which I don't. And a co-author also brings a lot of new experience stories to share. And that's one thing that I've tried to put in a lot of my books, and something I always enjoy in other people's writings, is stories that make it come alive, where you actually see how something worked and what lessons you can learn from that, instead of just telling your information. But I found some interesting things. Working with a co-author does not seem to make book writing go faster.
I would imagine it would go slower, but
yeah, you'd think that it would, go faster because one person's doing certain stuff and one person's doing another. But I found that it didn't. But it sure leads to a much better product than you can do on your own. You have the benefit of someone smart. I like working with smart people, and both of these are really, really smart people. To bounce ideas off, somebody with different perspectives to help clarify and correct your thinking. And as with software development, iteration is a key to writing. You just wouldn't believe how many times we go through chapters and chapters. Probably poor Candace didn't really expect all of these sorts of experiences. But the co-author provides more opportunities for iteration as we both make these multiple passes. We went back and forth a lot on, for example, the exact practices to include, exactly how to phrase them, how to group them, how to sequence them, and all that. I mean, just that alone for what, I don't know, 100 words or something, Candace, for the titles.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work, but that's the architecture of your book. And I learned a long time ago from writing books that every second you spend on architecture and structure and design of the book saves you a whole lot of fixing and rework and shuffling later on. So Candace helped a lot of that. And it was hard because we were really trying to keep this book short. I mean, you showed the front cover of the book there.
Right. I guess I should have shown that.
This is the other part.
Yeah.
That is not a very big book, especially in comparison to this book, Software Requirements 3rd edition. Okay?
Yeah.
And so we were really tightly focused on trying to provide a lot of content in a kind of short space. And that's harder to write short than it is to write long. So I think Candace certainly, and Joy years ago, found that writing a book's a whole lot of work. I'm probably not the easiest person to work with, but I think we had a good time. I think we did a really good job. I'm very happy with our product.
Yeah, that's awesome. And definitely a great output and a huge contribution to the community. So I want to just shift into our core topic for today around Agile software development. And I know, Carl, you kind of set Candace up for some of these questions because,
That's fine.
Speaking to her depth of experience, yes, and kind of how she brought that to the book. And I mean, what I've been noticing really just in the last year, and this definitely stood out from as I went through your book as well, and it's consistent with how I've been teaching and writing about business analysis for a long time. But there was this time 10 to 15 years ago where it felt like we were throwing away all the traditional business analysis stuff to figure out Agile, right? And how do we, what are we doing to do within this Agile environment? And it sort of is starting to feel to me like the pendulum is finally switching back, where we're seeing business analysis again as a thing, and Agile is certainly a part of it, and Agile software development is certainly a part of it. We need to work and collaborate within that. But in some ways, we're still kind of engaged in that debate of what's the VA's role in this environment anyways? So this would, first of all, for anybody listening in, we'd love to get your questions on doing business analysis in an Agile environment. If you have some questions that you want to run by Carl and Candace. But specifically, I just want to hear how you both see this, and are all the essential techniques from your book also essential in Agile? So Candace, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I can start.
Yeah.
And I'll probably start with saying, no one technique is truly required or essential for every single environment and every single project, Agile or not.
Yeah.
But we really focus on these 20 essential practices because they do merit consideration for every single project and every single environment, and maybe even especially Agile ones. But the thing I tried to emphasize while we were writing the book, and that I tell people to keep in mind, is when you're considering the techniques, it's more about the timing and how much you do at any given time than whether you do a technique or not. So take modeling the requirements. I am always using visual models. It is a cornerstone of our methodology at Argonne Digital. But how and when and how much I might do modeling would vary from a more traditional project where maybe you're doing most of the modeling up front, you're keeping it up to date as defects come in, maybe making some edits, but most of your work is up front. Whereas on my Agile projects, well, I'm only doing the process for just that sprint, and then I'll add new process steps as they come in. And that, continues every sprint, every release, and until the project's done or until the product is done. And so that technique to me is, again, maybe not essential for every project, but it's definitely essential in Agile to know where you are at any given time. I have one set of system flows that I have created and maintained over probably 6 or 7 years. And every time we do story refinement, we call it story time. I bring up those system flows. I'm like, okay, here is the exact place in this system flow that the story is going to take place. And a lot of times, actually, my Gherkin or BDD style acceptance criteria fall right out of those models. I'll just go through that's a decision point. That's going to be a given. And, when you get to the actual step that's going to have your trigger and your what should happen. And so I am always using many of these practices just in a slightly tweaked way on my Agile projects. However, I do think some of the practices are probably more universal on Agile projects, especially like understanding the business problem. Like if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve, whether it's Agile or traditional, you're probably not going to be successful. Understanding what your objectives are, establishing those solution boundaries, defining decision makers, analyzing your requirements, prioritizing requirements. If you can't prioritize, you're not going to get things built, and managing changes. So to me, I'm handful, and I don't actually know offhand, Carl, that actually aligns top 6 that you originally posted about. I feel like they're probably pretty close. Are pretty universal. I use them in almost every project. All the other ones, obviously, you would consider, but maybe not every project needs to evaluate events and responses. So the other ones are a little more case by case. But if you do kind of those handful, your project is more set up for success than for fear.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Carl, what would you add to that?
Well, I think Candace hit definitely all the important points. I think the things that we do around business analysis, and I won't say by the business analyst because the business analyst is a job title, but it's also a role. And no matter whether your team has a BA by that name or not, there are people that have to do this stuff. And when they're doing that, they're wearing their BA hat. And I think the way people should look at this, if they say, well, that doesn't apply to us because, we're doing something different, whether it's Agile or anything else, I suggest that readers look at the list of the 20 practices that we have and ask themselves some questions. Just go through that list, and Candace rattled off several of them that really seem to me to be globally applicable. And just ask yourself, would this practice add value to our project? Would it increase our chances of success? Would it reduce risk? Would it maybe keep us from getting in trouble? Could we get in trouble if we didn't do that? Like if we didn't spend some time on identifying key stakeholders, could that cause problems for us? And of course it could on any project, because if you don't identify your key stakeholders, if you miss somebody, then when they come along later on and say, hey, wait a minute, over here, I got some requirements, I got some constraints. Well, you're going to have to deal with that at that point later rather than earlier. So I think that if you go through that thought process, just about every project team would decide that these 20 practices are probably important, but as Candace mentioned, adjusted appropriately to meet your specific situation, either adjusted in terms of timing when you do them or depth of how far you go down on them at a particular time, maybe adjusted in terms of how much information is communicated verbally versus recorded for posterity and so forth. But I'm hard pressed to think of a project that wouldn't find all 20 of these kind of useful.
I like what you said about like, will it add value and is it going to help reduce risk on this project? And when you were talking about identifying stakeholders, that reminded me of my very, very first Agile role, or I shouldn't say Agile project, but like Agile role. And like we had identified a new stakeholder like the week before the sprint was supposed to start. And I was like, our requirements are not ready to go. And they're like, that's okay. We love change. I was like, great. Here's my draft requirements. They're not finalized. And 3 days into that sprint, we finally had the meeting with the stakeholders and the requirements changed and the developers were not happy. I was like, so I feel like even in Agile, right, you still like, yes, we could embrace that change, but also people weren't happy that they had to rework something so early in the cycle that really could have been avoided.
You said a really, really important word there, Laura, that I want to super stress, which is rework.
Yeah, rework.
I hate rework.
Everybody does.
I hate doing something over that I've already done and thought was past, Yeah. And there's always going to be some of that. It's the nature of our business. It's the nature of moving fast, and it's the nature of making assumptions or knowing that there are gaps before you can finalize things, and that's fine. But I don't think we should use the notion of embracing change and being able to adapt to change. We should not use that as a substitute for thinking. We should not use that as a substitute for taking the actions to understand some of these things before we get into it, because whether you can adapt to change or not, there's always a price tag associated with change. Even if you just have a conversation with somebody and decide, well, I don't think we're going to do that. that took some time, let alone actually building something or having to rebuild something that you've already done. And I think you have to anticipate a certain amount of change. You have to accommodate change, but I don't think we should just say, well, we'll just change it later and just assume that rework is perfectly fine with us, because it's not fine with the customers. They don't want to have to wait longer because you're doing something to fix it later.
Yeah, it definitely didn't sit well with the team. We learned our lesson. Nicely, we learned it during sprint 1. So we have a great question in the chat, specifically about from Jummy. What are the specific deliverables of a business analyst in an agile environment? Do one of you want to speak to that?
I nominate Candace.
Well, I'll give the always relevant answer of it depends. Like every agile environment I've been in has been different, and the deliverables are in some ways different. They may call them different things. I've heard the term agile requirements document that we've used before at different places. At the end of the day, it's a lot of the same core deliverables, right? So your visual models, if you're using those, your data mappings, your data dictionaries, those still are deliverables in Agile. You just may not have them all done at once. You're building them iteratively. And maybe you don't call it a BRD, you have a backlog of user stories, but you're still going to have a lot of that same level of detail, either in the story or the acceptance criteria, that you would see in, a BRD or an SRS or, whatever you call the traditional deliverables you would have as a BA. So in my view, the terminology is going to vary, but it's really at the end of the day, getting to the requirements, the right requirements to build the right thing at the right time, and any supporting documentation of that.
I love that. It always depends, right? And I found it depends on who, like your team too. I had went from one agile team to another in a different company, and their expectations or their ideas of what a business analyst should do on that team were completely different. And I kind of thought like I needed to do what I was doing in that other company because I kind of had figured that out. And I ended up stepping on people's toes who thought they were supposed to do some of those things. So I feel like it does change by team as well. So having those conversations with your team in terms of who's doing what can also be really, really helpful. But yeah.
One thing I want to add is that, and Candace kind of touched on this. People sometimes talk about agile requirements, and I don't like that term, agile requirements, because it conveys the impression that these are somehow different from other sorts of requirements. And I don't think that's true. I think that the developer needs the same information to build the correct product properly, regardless of what development lifecycle you're following or what you choose to call those pieces of information. You need the same knowledge. And in fact, Joy Beatty and I wrote an article on that topic several years ago, basically called, Agile Requirements. What's the big deal? Because I think it's the same knowledge. And you might say, well, we don't write detailed requirements. We write acceptance criteria. Okay, fine. That's just another way of looking at the same piece of information. Instead of describing, go build this so it does this, you're saying, how do we tell if it's doing what we want it to do properly, and find problems where it's not? So it's the same pieces of knowledge. And I think it's important for people to recognize that there's no mystique associated with agile requirements. There's a vocabulary, which I think is a little debatable, but the knowledge is the same, and pretending that people aren't going to get it is not useful. Certainly you're going to get it in different degrees of detail at different times, coming from different people. That's all fine, but you still need the same knowledge or you can't build the product.
That's a great point. So shifting here a bit to the data part, and Candace, one of the things that stuck out to me when we had kind of an initial get to know you conversation was just this depth of experience you have doing business analysis work in a automated processing environment. I believe I'm getting the words right there. And so could you just share a little bit about the role that you filled, how that's evolved over time, and how you got into a role like this with this, very deep technical expertise? And I don't think you have the technical background beforehand. I just think it's going to be really fascinating to people on the call to hear a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's definitely been a crazy journey. So for the past 7 years or so, I've been working as kind of a technical product owner. So I'm not doing a lot of market analysis, A/B testing. I'm working directly with the developers or engineers, depending on what you call them. database architects, solution architects, and really in the nitty gritty, like how do we solution and solve for the business problems? But it was kind of by accident. So my background from education is actually in structural engineering and religious studies, but that was a side hobby. I did my master's thesis on predicting hurricane, storm surge, and scour damage to the Houston bridge and roadway infrastructure. So kind of in its own way technical, if you consider coding in MATLAB technical or a thing, but definitely a different ball game than traditional software development. So a couple of moves combined with a recession, unfortunately, made me switch careers from engineering into product management. That's how I started at Argonne Digital, formerly C-Level at the time. And the first several years were probably more on traditional product management projects. So front end, UIs, users, et cetera. And that was pretty familiar to me, right? Like I am a user. I know how to use user interfaces and do things. But in about 2016, I got in this very technical back-end, no UI, lots of API calls project. It was really all about automating the flow of data between various systems. And at that time, I probably couldn't have told you what an API was. So it was a very steep learning curve and a huge change. And I definitely didn't know how to do SQL queries and had no idea what MongoDB was either. But I am always innately curious. I love just getting hands-on. So I just dug in. I opened up the SQL database. I Googled Stack Overflow a lot. And little by little, I learned. So I went in and I made the API calls. I structured the JSON and learned how much one little comma missing can bork your API calls. And I did that enough that like eventually I kind of knew everything better than even the engineers. And it is one of the things I look for now in new hires is like, are you curious? Do you want to get hands-on? Do you want to try things versus just, well, when I had to get up to speed, I looked for the documentation or I asked, the person who knew, because like that shows that they want to get in and get their hands dirty. And so even, if we don't know how something works in our current system, like, well, let's go try it out. Like, let's see what it does. I don't know the answer, but if we do it, then we know. And that it's really grown over time. So when I started, I was on one PO or the PO for one team, 6 to 8 engineers. And now I support a team of up to 15 product owners across over 12 development teams and probably over 100 engineers. And so we own dozens of microservices in addition to, kind of major applications. It's definitely been a journey, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I love what you said about getting your hands in it as a way to really need to learn some of the technical. And it brings me back to like my very first testing role was testing this proprietary database system that doesn't exist anymore. It was proprietary to that company, but like I learned database structures by learning how to operate in that system. So I can see that being a really useful way of just figuring out the data. So when you mentioned that you got to share a lot of the expertise in the data modeling sections of the book. And if you're just joining us, Carl and Candace are both authors of this new book, Software Requirements Essentials. I actually need to be, I've got I didn't have it. Okay, Software Requirements Essentials. And so can you talk a little bit about what are some of the key best practices you're hoping to leave readers with? And I think we have a related question that's come in a few times about like how proficient you need to be in creating flows and models. So that might be something to weave into if it fits. Yeah.
Okay, I can go first. Yeah, one of the things I've learned on these projects, especially these technical back-end automated projects, is the devil is really in those data details. I have never seen so much hubbub over like a single missing or additional character than when we're dealing with data. We had one time like a major defect because one system had it being 5 characters, another system had it being 4 characters, and so it couldn't save and everything was just broken. So, it really drove home that like understanding the data structure and the data requirements really drives the success when you're dealing with those, especially those projects that are about moving data around. So for me, a lot of the important kind of takeaways and practices, I really like to keep my data modeling separate from like my user stories. So if I'm working on like the relationships in the ERD or the entity relationship diagram, I don't want to put that in my story directly. I'll reference it, but I want it to actually stand alone, because that's going to supersede or transcend any one user story or one sprint. It's going to live throughout the course of the product. And so I really like to get those fundamentals of like, what are those relationships that we want to enforce or not enforce, before we dive into the details. And the same thing with the data dictionary. I have learned this lesson very that if you're going to be trying to piece it together of like, where did I implement this one specific data mapping in what sprint, and try to find that story. And it's really hard. So having that segregated really helps it, and then gives you that source of truth to go back to say, hey, where's this data source from? Where does it move through? So I love that. In terms of the proficiency, like everything, you can learn to be proficient, right? So I always find it's about trying things out. My first data flows, it's actually a funny story. When I first started at Argonne Digital, I started a visual models book. And so one of the first things they had me do, they're like, oh, go read the book chapters and try the exercises out. And I did pretty good until I got no knowledge in it. Like, I got one circle. But once you try it a few times, you iterate, you ask questions. And for me, at least, once you get on an actual project, it's a lot easier to know what data is moving around. You learn those skills over time. So that's probably the kind of the best practices on my end.
Yeah. My experience with ERDs is super similar. Like, somebody's like, we really need an ERD. And I was like, all right, I'll figure that out, and bought a book and figured out how to put one together, and it created a lot of clarity for the project. Carl, anything you want to add to what we've been talking about here with data modeling?
Yeah, in fact, I think we can step back a little bit and generalize some of the points from just data modeling to the other aspects of modeling and the like. Candace mentioned that she likes to keep her data models separate from the user stories, and I think that's very prudent, because data spans multiple stories. And you can have the same thing, if you're taking a use case approach, is that you might have multiple use cases, each of which manipulate various parts of a common data entity. One use case might create a particular data entity, one might modify it, one might delete it. And so I think taking a step back from the details of functionally oriented requirements representations, and looking at what kind of information do we have that spans multiple of these, that don't make sense to then park in any single one of them. So along that line, another category of information that spans a lot of bits of functionality are quality attribute requirements. Things like performance and reliability and security. You might have parts of an application that have specific stringent security requirements, and others that are public. And so it doesn't make sense to have things at too granular a level, but you need to find the right level of abstraction in which to represent those pieces of knowledge so that they can properly influence the user stories or functional requirements to which they apply. So I think we need to step back from just stories as being the one quantum we use to represent information, and recognize there are things that are at higher levels. So speaking of abstraction, I am a huge fan, like Candace, of modeling. I took a course on structured systems analysis and design, I think in 1986, and that totally changed how I thought about building software, because I'd never thought about, well, let's draw some pictures first and kind of get a higher level understanding and see how pieces fit together and how stuff moves around. And then we'll figure out what exactly do we have to build to make all that happen. So to me, that was just a tremendously powerful insight. And I'm a huge fan of modeling. In fact, I wrote an article a little while ago talking about why modeling skill is really a core business analyst skill. So the question was, how proficient should someone be at creating flows or models? Well, you should be proficient enough that you can recognize, when do we have a problem for which drawing a picture would be a good, helpful tool. And then you have to be able to know enough to say, well, what would be the right kind of picture? And you also have to be wise enough to say, I'm not going to make up my own picture. Please do not invent your own modeling notations. We have dozens of them available, lots of kinds of pictures that can show lots of kinds of information. And I think the probability that you're going to be working on something for which none of those are suitable is pretty small. So remember that these are communication tools. And if you're drawing a different kind of picture that I don't understand, we are not communicating effectively. We're using different languages. So you need to be able to recognize the problem for which a model is the solution. You need to be able to choose the right hammer for that particular nail. And then you need to be proficient enough that you can draw it correctly, following the right syntaxes, and someone else can read it and understand it and modify it and use it to do their own work. But I think modeling is a really core BA skill. And again, whether your title is BA or your role is BA, you should be able to draw the right kinds of pictures. And one more point on pictures is that they show information at different levels of abstraction. If you got a stack of user stories, you have a list of functional requirements, that's pretty high res, low level detail. But sometimes you need to step back, or sometimes certain stakeholders don't need to see that, but they need to see a bigger picture. And so drawing various kinds of models can communicate that more effectively to the right audience at the level they need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we teach wireframes, process models, ERDs, data diction, like all those things for that reason, right? You need to have that big picture. That's where the requirements come from. So like there's a related question here that I think it makes sense maybe to do now, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into data modeling into the user stories. But Yvette has this question about what suggestions do you have to minimize the duplication of effort to develop and maintain an SRD BRD in addition to maintaining backlogs and user stories?
That sounds like another question for Candace to tackle initially.
I mean, my initial reaction would be to ask more questions about this, but I guess it's not the way this works.
Well, we can say, like, if we have a question, we can ask Yvette to give us a bit more information in the chat.
Yeah, because my first question would be like, why are we duplicating the effort in the first place? Most frequently I see it as it's a mechanism to create the baselines, right? You create the SRD or BRD for a portion of the project in an Agile space so that you can snapshot it and say, yep, we're going to baseline these requirements. And you can use baseline in quotes depending on, your exact process. Maybe they're not really locked until they get to the sprint, but they're semi-locked. So that's most frequently how I've seen it. And in that case, I mean, I would just maintain the backlog, and then I would either use a tool or manual to export those backlog stories into the SRS or BRD or whatever document I need. And we talk a little bit about that in the book as well. There are some tools that even support doing that automatically. The only other piece that I could see that you would add, right, are some of those surrounding information, right? So a big pile of user stories is not usually enough if you're going to create an SRS or a BRD. So those links to those visual models, the glossary, your stakeholder catalog, all those other pieces of information that you have, you can either put in those documents or reference from those documents.
I would agree. I think thinking about what is in the BRD as context, right? What are the pieces that you need? Yeah. Was that Paula jumping in?
That was not Paula.
Oh, sorry. And I just want to acknowledge we've got Paula Bell handling things behind the scenes, pulling comments up and making sure all of our technical is going well as well. So thank you, Paula. So I guess
can I add a couple of thoughts to that as well?
Yeah, go for it, Carl. Go for it.
This question of duplication is actually pretty important, and it shows up in several ways. There can be duplication of effort, which was that particular question. And there, I think anytime you duplicate things like that too, you have a problem, because as soon as you have more than one copy of a piece of information, you have the opportunity for one of them to get changed for some good reason or by accident, and the other one's not. And now you have an inconsistency and nobody knows which one to believe. I saw that, for example, once I reviewed some use cases that one of my consulting clients had created, and they had embedded in these use cases a chunk of some data definitions, a data structure. And they had 3 instances of it in 3 use cases, and they weren't the same, but they were logically the same. And so I had no idea which one, if any, was correct. So I think it's much better to have one master source of these pieces of information that are not local to a specific, say, story, so that you point to it. And that way, anytime that gets modified because somebody has to change an attribute or add a new field or something, then everything that points to it is automatically kept current. Now that also then helps you trace to understand, well, if we changed it, what software do we have to change? What designs do we have to change? What tests do we have to change? So that becomes a traceability aid as well, to let you kind of connect those pieces. Whereas if you have multiple instances of it, you're going to be in trouble. And another place where I saw this happen, that's a little bit maybe closer to the question, sometimes when people start using a requirements management tool to store their requirements in, then they still maintain, and I think this is the bad idea, they still maintained a separate document structure. And it's like, I had a client once that was treating the documents as the main requirements repository, and they were then feeding them into the requirements management tool, basically so they could do some very complex traceability stuff. But then not only are you maintaining two sets of information, but again, the master source is not going to be always known, and you've got a very good chance of somebody working from some piece of information that's not current or not accurate. You're better off storing it one place, preferably electronically, and then if you need a subset of it, as Candace was mentioning, then generate a report that says, okay, for this sprint, this is the subset of this information that we're going to be working on. Or for this release, here's a sub software requirement spec that we're going to pull out of our database. But watch out for the duplication.
For sure. Yeah, it's a great tip, Carl. So I have just one last question about user stories and data modeling. And then I've seen quite a few great questions in the comments, but we're going to switch and just completely go to open Q&A from there. So if you do have other questions that you'd like to ask Carl and Candace, this is a great time to get them into the comments. But the question, and we've really kind of already talked around this, so maybe it's just are there final tips on when you are actually in this, you mentioned being a technical product owner and you're writing user stories, right? And I always think of user stories as being so business driven, right? So how is that actually manifesting in terms of a user story and that meets an agile process when you're in this really technical role? Can you just speak a little bit to that? Yeah,
absolutely. And I will say I am constantly learning new ways to write my technical requirements. I try things out. I see how it works with engineering and testing, and I'll be like, oh, that was a really silly way to write that. I'm going to change that for next time. But when I first started in this technical role, I inherited a backlog, and it was a backlog full of stories that went roughly as the middleware layer. I want to map field A to field B so that I can map field A to field B, which is, probably the most literal sense of trying to shoehorn a data requirement into a user story format.
Right.
It told me nothing about, well, why do we care about moving field A to field B, or who was requesting it? And so I am a big fan of really digging deep, even if it is back end, right? Those details can live in a mapping document, a system interface table, or worst case in your acceptance criteria. But your user story should really be about who cares about this and why. So, we talk about that a little bit in the book. Somebody cared about moving that piece of data. Maybe it was a compliance officer so that we can do reporting on the back end, or a credit officer if we need it to run someone's credit, of why we need to move it. So really understanding who wants that requirement and, why, what value does it bring? The other piece, I don't use them as often now, but there is a technical user story format as well that focuses on in order to fulfill some sort of business need, a system must do a thing. It's probably not the exact terminology, but you can still focus on, you need to fulfill a business need, right? We're doing it for a reason, but then you don't have to just shoehorn it into, well, a user or a system, because, well, in theory, systems shouldn't have once unless we're rise of machine territory. And still give that data right directly.
That's a whole nother discussion. Yeah.
It's a different LinkedIn Live, and I would not be a good speaker for that. So in that way, being able to focus on who really needed it for the actual user story part. And then in the Gherkin acceptance criteria, especially if you're writing with that given, when then that behavior-driven development, it also tweaks a little bit. So when you have users, when you have a UI, it's pretty straightforward. Given I'm in a certain place on a certain page, when I do something, I click a button or I fill in a field, then something happens. when you're talking data and all this technical backend stuff, it's similar, but it's almost, I think of it more like setting up a use case or a test case. Sorry. So the givens become more about your data preconditions, like what data has to be in place so that I can kick off the test. The when is still your trigger, but it might be a system trigger, right? When I receive an API request, or when I get this database request, then the system still does something. So it's just a slightly different way of thinking about the given when thens, but it's hugely beneficial when we start getting to testing, because engineers know what their data preconditions are. They can automate in the book for people to see technical. So they'll say, given the data state, then do something. And so it's just a quick mindset change to always make sure your givens are preconditions and your whens are triggers. But they can follow the same formats as long as you do that little bit of digging.
Yeah,
it's interesting
you cut up
too.
just a little bit there, Candace, but I think we got the essence of the last piece. Go ahead, Carl.
When Candace was talking about early in our discussion here, the how people can decide whether these practices that we've suggested are valuable for their project, be it Agile or anything else. I think one she kind of hedged on, which makes sense, is does every project need to think about events? Okay, because we do have a practice that says you want to understand system events and responses. And what Candace was just describing in terms of like a given when then pattern for writing acceptance criteria or tests is in fact an event thought process. You're saying when something happens under certain conditions, here's what should result. That's an event thought process. So even if the core thought process for understanding requirements for your system isn't, an event-driven kind of system, considering events will sometimes fill in gaps in your knowledge or let you look at a problem or situation in a certain perspective that's more insightful than, a more traditional functional-oriented or data-oriented view. These are all complementary things. And I think that's why I think these practices are so globally valuable, because you might do a little bit more of this one on a particular system and a little bit less of that one, but they're all going to have some applicability, and you just have to look at them and say, which would be the most useful to me, which provides the greatest benefit for the least work and the lowest risk.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat that perhaps you've already answered with what you've shared, but I just it's from Alejandro around how do you approach API integration requirements when there is no human interaction involved? So is that similar to what we were just talking about with data fields, or is there another nuance with an API integration specifically that we would want to speak to? Yeah.
So the main difference is probably going to be in those acceptance criteria, right? You're going to be much more specific about, who's calling whom in an API integration. But your user story, that higher level requirement really should get down to, at some point, there's a type of user. It could be an internal business user. It could be, reporting or compliance or any, maybe it's not a direct user because there's no UI, but somebody cares about this because they asked us to do it. And then in your acceptance criteria, it would be something like, when I get that API request from the upstream system, then I have to go do something and return the response back to them in a specific format. So you get into more of those nitty gritties. Whereas, if you're just writing from a UI perspective, I might write a user story that says, I need to log in. And on the back end, that's going to be, 6 API calls to the authentication server and to, whoever else. But it's all very abstract and kind of in the code versus in the story. So that's the main difference that I've seen.
Yeah.
I think, again, that's a case where event thinking, when there's no user interaction involved, there's no dialogue between a human being and a system, like for a middleware system or a physical device or something, events can often be more insightful. And maybe then you don't have to say, well, who is this important to? It's important to the proper functioning of the device. And that may be good enough.
Yep. Yeah, I joke a little bit on the assess events and responses, but I do a lot of it.
So there was kind of switching gears a bit. There was a very high level question that came in from Lonnie early on. And that is, how should a BA work with a product owner in Agile? So who has some thoughts to share on that one?
Well, I know Lonnie, but I'm going to let Candace handle that question because she's done all that stuff.
No, just like everything else, it really depends, right? So, I mean, I would kind of suggest having a conversation of like how does this specific BA and this specific product owner want to work together? Um, I have typically like it's kind of weird because we call them different things. So, like on my projects, I am the technical product owner, but I'm not really the product owner who can make decisions, right? The product owner, the single ringable neck for when things go wrong, the one who can set all the priorities. That's usually my business partners, right? They are wearing that product owner hat in addition to their day job, but they have no idea about business analysis. So they're paired with me as a technical product owner to help get those requirements out of them, get them in the right format to get to the engineering team, and facilitate discussions on those prioritizations. So it's similar to what I would see some places might call a PO versus a BA. It's really about finding that rhythm. A lot of times the BAs may be doing the acceptance criteria or the modeling, and the POs are more focused on stories, features, and kind of keeping the backlog healthy, right? Like what's coming up next? What's my big rock that I want to focus on and prioritize versus the details? But it will really vary project to project and person to person. I've found some very hands-on POs that don't want the BAs in their details because they want to be in the details. So it definitely is going to depend.
Candace made several really important points I want to build on quickly if I could.
Yeah.
One is that it depends, which is the right answer to just about every question that comes up in these things. And sometimes people don't like that answer, but it's true. That's just the way it is. But she also pointed out that when you have people that are collaborating, and that's what we're talking about here. If you have a BA and a PO who are working together in some way, we have to talk about how are we going to work together. And I think that doesn't happen enough. I think too often people make assumptions both about responsibilities in terms of how we're going to work together. You'll do this, I'll do that. But we also don't necessarily talk about what's our preferred communication mechanisms, preferred communication styles. And that's a really important part of any kind of collaboration is understanding not only who's going to do what, because you don't want people stepping on each other's toes and intruding into their territory because they want the details. But you also don't want gaps because then we'd have to bridge the gap. Of course, Laura knows more about bridging gaps than just about anybody, but we don't want to have to do that. We want to have a pretty clear understanding of who's going to be doing what, when, and we want to discuss our commitments. And I think it's always perfectly valid, in fact, necessary for people to say to their collaborators, here's what you can expect from me. Here's what I need from you to do my job. What do you need from me? Let's have those conversations so that it's out on the table. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for problems and hard feelings.
I agree. Our first step of our business analysis process framework involves clarifying your role and kind of figuring out this community. It's like you think it should be defining the role. It's like, no, you need to clarify your role. So right there with you. All right, here's a question, and maybe, Carl, this would be a great one for you to start with, but you both can let me know. It's from Ruby. Is requirements traceability matrix still relevant in Agile? I think that's kind of a fun one.
Well, I can't think of why it wouldn't, because requirements traceability has nothing to do with how you built your product. It has to do with what you've built. And so if you have some kind of requirements in some form, doesn't matter what form they're in, but you've got some block of information that says we need to build something. And maybe you've got some higher level information that says why we need to build those things. And then you say, well, let's go build it. So we're going to build, we're going to do some design work and maybe make some models, and we're going to probably write some code and maybe have some tests and who knows what else. And if you're interested in traceability, you're just building a map that ties all those pieces of information together with a bunch of threads so that you can follow them and make sure that we said we were going to build this. Did we in fact build that? Okay. Or we changed it. Which tests do we have to change now to test the modified version? And traceability helps with all that. So the fact that it's being built in an agile approach as opposed to some other approach, I think is irrelevant. The question then boils down to is that how important is it to you to have that information accumulated in your project, and how much risk are you undertaking if you don't build it? Because it's impossible to reconstruct that at the end. You can't get to the end of a project and say, okay, let's see how these pieces all fit together. You have to accumulate traceability information as you go along. And then it just becomes a part of your process. That one of the things you do when you perform a task is you keep a record of how these pieces fit together. So I don't think it matters whether the approach is agile or something else. If you think traceability is important, you should do it.
Yep, I agree. And you may not call it a requirements traceability matrix, right? Because that implies, probably an Excel document of some sort. But requirements traceability is sometimes even more important in Agile because we're building things iteratively. So it becomes even more important to know, what am I going to break if I add this new field and make it required? Versus, if know most of the things up front in a traditional world, you may not have as much of that. And so I personally am a big fan of doing that traceability in a requirements management tool versus trying to manually keep track of it.
Yeah.
But certainly, probably even just yesterday, trying to figure out where, hey, we want to change this interface, what all is it going to change? That's easy. If I go to my RM tool and say, yep, here are all the features we built around it. And, here's how it would impact those.
Yeah, tremendously valuable for that impact analysis so that you can find all those threads. I'm sure we've all worked on projects where somebody made a change and we thought we got it all done. And then you just keep finding these little bits of things that weren't changed that were supposed to be changed. And it becomes sort of this lingering, painful sore rather than just a quick stab.
Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time and thank you both so much. Paula, before we go to the closing slides, did we have any big relevant question to these topics that we've been talking about that I had overlooked? I've been doing my best to keep an eye on the chat and the conversation at the same time.
Yeah, so no, I think the majority of the questions were around themes that have been addressed. So there were themes around around certifications, that always comes up as well, but there was also themes around deliverables, data analysis, how do you work with your stakeholders, things of that nature. I pretty much feel that you've answered. We can't get to every individual question, but as far as the themes that I've been seeing hitting YouTube and LinkedIn, I believe we've hit the major themes at this point.
Great. So Candace and Carl, would you like to share a little bit more about how people can stay connected with you and learn more about everything you talked about today?
Sure. Those are our websites right there, and emails. If you want to learn more about the book, softwarerex.com is the good URL. It's got some information about some videos there and some downloads. There's about 15 or so downloads of templates and checklists. I'm a big fan of checklists. We've got a lot in the book, and so those are all available for downloading, and some spreadsheet tools as well.
Awesome. And Candace, it looks like connecting with you on the LinkedIn is the best approach. Yeah.
Yeah, probably the fastest way to get a hold of me.
Perfect. And I would love to connect with you as well. Please reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. We're also on Facebook. This replay will be on LinkedIn as well as our YouTube channel on Bridging the Gap. And we have a ton of free resources as well as information about our training programs on bridgingthegap.com. It does have those hyphens. And one that I didn't mention, but is really relevant to the conversation today, we have a free data modeling training, which goes over some of the core data modeling skill sets. And it's a great way to just, if this whole conversation around data modeling was completely new to you, it would be a great way to get a broad overview. And I believe that's at bridgingthegap.com/DM free. So you can find that as well. But Carl and Candace, thank you so much for sharing your time. As an author, I understand how important it is to be out there and get some exposure for your book and also just, continue the journey and continue the conversation that people have. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for, answering so many questions and being so generous with your knowledge.
Well, thanks very much, Laura. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And thanks for your help, Paula, behind the scenes too.
Yes, thanks for having us.
All right. And thank you, all of you listening in, for being here and participating. It was great to see your comments in the chat.